Welcome back to the Extension Master Gardener Training Program. In our Lesson 2, we will be talking about turfgrass species adapted for Kansas. We will first begin with turfgrass morphology and then lead into the turfgrasses that are able to be grown and cultivated in Kansas and the benefits that these turfgrasses have for each species. So as we're in Section 2, moving forward, turfgrass species adapted for Kansas. We do have a wide range of species that can be grown here, and they do have a different morphology. Each species does. There's different identifying characteristics, and we call this turfgrass terminology. First, we start with the growth habit. There's multiple different growth habits. It's important to know, from stolons, rhizomes. Some plant species or grass species have both stolons and rhizomes, and some have neither, which is a bunch type. This helps with identifying. If you know they have these, you know how it helps to how you manage these types of species. So a bunch type of grass I call a one seed, one plant. So the seed will germinate and it will grow. And as it grows, it will kind of tiller out and just grow into a bunch. So that is one type of growth habit. You can see that here is tall fescue is a perfect example. This is one of the reasons we have to overseed tall fescue in the fall, because we may lose some due to heat or drought or a disease in the middle of the summertime, and then we have to seed back in those areas because this plant has no way of rejuvenating itself or growing and spreading. It's only a bunch type of grass species. A turfgrass structure is a stolon, which, as you can see here on the right side of the slide, a stolon is an above ground stem. So as the plant grows from a seed, it grows up and grows a plant. And when it wants to spread and make new plants, it can send out a stolon, which is an above ground stem, and it will produce a new plant at each node. So it's some people call them the runners that run, through the gardens. Bermuda grass is an example of this. It will produce a stem across the surface and create new plants. This is a positive attribute sometimes. It is a negative attribute sometimes. If I'm managing a football field, I would like to have a grass species that has this attribute because it's able to rejuvenate and fill in after athletes rip and tear it up throughout the week. Negative attribute is maybe it's running into your flower beds, or it's crawling underneath your concrete or sidewalk as a rhizome, which is the next one that does. Maybe we have to trim more type of stuff. So the opposite of a stolon is a rhizome, which is a below ground stem. So it's just like a stolon, except it goes underneath the ground and pops up with new plants. This is the same type of positive and negative attributes like a stolon, but it's more protected. So if we have a turfgrass species that maybe has a rhizome, and say it got hit by heat and drought, these plant parts are protected underneath the ground, and they're able to rejuvenate maybe with a little bit of water and a little bit of fertility as well. And this also helps hold the soil in a lot, having that plant part underground. So we have three different types. Some species have stolons only. Some species have stolons and rhizomes. Some only have rhizomes, and some of them have neither. So if you can find those things on the plant, then you can completely eliminate different types of species if you're trying to identify, and you know how to help manage it. Another terminology that we have is the presence of hairs. If there is hairs present, it's a warm season grass. If there's no hairs, it can be either a warm season or a cool season. So if you see hairs on the plant species, you know it's automatically a warm season grass species. And you can eliminate any cool season species. For example, willow grass is one that has hairs all along the stem and along the leaf blades, and they're very persistent, and you can see them if you just rip them off and get up close to that grass as well. This is a great identifying characteristic, but not the only identifying characteristic, along with the stolons and rhizomes. The next terminology we'd like to cover is called vernation. Vernation there's two different types. It's either rolled or folded, and it's the way the leaf orients around the stem. I like to think about it kind of as like your collar-ish, or your neck in your collar. You can have a folded neck, or you can have a rolled neck. Here you can see some sketches folded where that stem is more of a square or flat folded area, or the stem is more of a rolled type. A close-up visual of this, you can see a folded vernation here and a rolled vernation here. This refers to which the new blades emerge from the sheath or that area around the plant. Don't be too concerned about this, as in this is just going to help you identify. If you used a dichotomous key before, you know it's going to go through these things to help identify plants, and this is just one of the identifying characteristics, and I want you to be aware of it if you see this terminology in some of the literature moving forward. But don't worry too much about the differences until you get into the identifying specifically a species or variety of turfgrass. There's different textures as well. We call coarse textured grass, which are very wide bladed plants. Has anybody been down to Florida? They have a turfgrass down there called St. Augustine, where it seems like the blades of the grass are about as big as wide as your thumb. We call that more of a coarse textured, where the opposite is fine textured, which are thin leaves, which typically more people are attracted to those types of grass species, as it's a thinner type blade like a perennial ryegrass or a Kentucky bluegrass type species. Some other ones, we have the leaf blade, collar, ligule, and leaf tip. Those will hit just very quickly, as these are all on different parts of the plants. We also have venation, not vernation. Venation just refers to the prominent of veins in the leaves. You can see here, these are prominent leaf veins in this Kentucky 31, where over here in this annual bluegrass, you see that there's no visible veins present. It's important whenever you're trying to identify a turfgrass species, if you pick up annual bluegrass comparatively to a tall fescue species, you can just help. It's one more checkbox on one or the other to help identify it. A collar is another part of the turfgrass plant, and that's where the leaf blade and leaf sheath join. There's many different types of collars on grass species. You have a continuous collar that wraps around. You have a divided collar where you can only see part of the collar, and then you have a broad collar, which could be very thick, and this will be the white area right around that sheath application or that sheath part, or you have a very narrow one. Right? Again, this is just another identifying characteristic whenever you pull in and looking at grass species to help out with. The ligule is one of the easier ones to see. This is also around the collar. It is a protrusion that happens right around the sheath area or base of the leaf blade. It could be absent where there's no ligule there. It could be membranous, which is just a small part of the plant that kind of sticks up around the base, and then you could have kind of a fringe of hairs. Crabgrass, this is one way to help identify crabgrass by looking at that collar and looking at the hairs on it. And then right around the ligule, you have what's called the auricles. The auricles wrap around kind of the appendages at the edges of the leaf blade. Some wrap around, or they called claw-like. Some can be short and stubby, and then some grass plants don't have them at all. So these are all, like I said, just terminology, identifying characteristics that sometimes you have to have a hand lens to look at these because they're very small on that plant. So this is the basic type of science behind it. And some of the other characteristics that I like, they're easier to see and they're very simple. For example, the leaf tip. Okay, you can have what's called a pointed leaf tip, which everybody thinks, well, that's kind of a no-brainer. All grass leaf tips are pointed. But actually, there are some that are more boat-shaped, where the end of that leaf kind of turns and wraps and comes to a point more like the front end of a boat instead of like a sword, where it would be the pointed part of it. This will definitely help with identifying the bluegrasses from all other cool season. Annual bluegrass and Kentucky bluegrass have this boat-shaped tip as well. Another easy to identify one is a midrib. Some grass species have a very prominent midrib, which is the a prominent vein that goes right down the middle of the leaf, where some of them do not have that visible midrib. It's just a continuous leaf sheath or leaf blade going across the whole thing. Other ones out there, don't want to hit too much, but just know some of these can be subjective. For example, like color. Color green to you could be darker than green to you. So there are some generalistic color qualities within plants. For example, Kentucky 31 tall fescue is a lighter green than the turf type tall fescues. Your buffalo grass is going to be more of a bluish green than fescue, which is going to be a more darker, rich green. And we already touched on the leaf texture, the coarse and wide, and inflorescence. A lot of times in the textbooks you'll see this inflorescence is a panicle or it's a raceme, or the different shapes of the inflorescence that's on, or the seed pods that are on the plant. But we don't see those a lot in turf because we're mowing them off all the time. If you can't identify one, sometimes I've seen people just dig one up, set it to the side, let it flower to help identify if you can't identify from the other characteristics. So with that is the identification characteristics, and then from now we will move on to the different types of species. We'll talk about the good attributes, some negative attributes of each species, where one fits, where one doesn't fit. But before we get to that, I do like to note that Kansas is located in the transition zone. The transition zone is an area within the United States, as you can see here on this slide, where both cool and warm season grass species can be grown. I say can be grown. That doesn't mean we can grow them all really, really well, because in the transition zone, many times it's too warm for cool season grasses in the summer, or too cold, or too warm for cool season grasses in the summer, or too cold for warm season grasses in the wintertime. So I always like to say we can grow both cool and warm season grasses here in Kansas poorly. And we are located on the most northwestern part of the transition zone, which makes it even more difficult when you get towards those outskirts of that area as well. So we can grow both warm and cool season grasses, and as long as you know when they grow, and you can understand that a warm season grass, if you follow this curve, this is just a general growth rate, grows predominantly in the summertime, and then goes dormant in the fall, and it is dormant through the wintertime. And then as we say about March, April, May, it starts to wake back up and grows. Then we know that's the time where we're planting. That's the time we need to feed it. That's the time we need to do stuff to those grass species, because the environment is right for it to grow. So we wouldn't want to plant this back here in November, these types of species, because the environment's not going to be right for it to grow. And the same thing with cool season grasses. Cool season grasses grow predominantly in the cooler times of the year. In the springtime, they green up from winter here in Kansas, and then in the summertime, they just kind of maintain. And these curves are based on non-irrigated turfgrass stands. We do see now that cool season grasses are growing more in the summertime because we are watering them with irrigation systems to try to keep them green and growing. So it's not slowing down a growth rate as much. But still, during those times, we're really trying to just keep it alive and make it through that hot, warm, and droughty summer that we're having. And fall is the second hump of the growth curve. This is the optimal time for fertilization. This is the optimal time for planting new grass species of the cool season, or the cool season species, and get it prepared for winter. And then in the springtime, the same thing. Now, with a lot of our practices, we're going to recommend the fall instead of the spring, because in the fall, your soil temperatures are warm. You have a lot of microbial activity. You can get good root growth because the soils are warm and the ambient air temperatures are cooling off. We got, cooler night temperatures. In the spring, yes, it wants to grow. During that time, we have very cold soils from the winter time. And we have the air temperature starting to warm up, and it takes us a lot of energy to warm that soil up, so we don't get a lot of root growth. We don't get a lot of those seeding is not as successful. So we try to make sure that we really harp on that fall time and maintenance calendar when it comes to cool season grasses. Now, of these season grasses we have in Kansas, we have both tall fescue, Kentucky bluegrass, perennial ryegrass, creeping bentgrass, and fine leaf fescues. The two bolded here is tall fescue and Kentucky bluegrass. Those are the predominant two cool season grasses we will use in home lawns. Perennial ryegrass has been noted and noticed in some seed mixtures. Sometimes it's okay to have a little bit of that in it because it grows real rapidly, but it is not heat and drought tolerant. So a consistent perennial ryegrass lawn is not a viable situation, especially here in Kansas. Now, creeping bentgrass, very similar to perennial ryegrass. It is not very heat, not very drought tolerant, but it has one very positive attribute that some turf managers like. Who in here plays golf by chance? Okay. Has any of the rest of you seen a golf course? Okay. On the golf courses, the putting greens are creeping bentgrass. They're able to be mown at a fraction of an inch. And because it's able to be mown and survive at a fraction of an inch, it's okay to be grown in that situation because it is a small acreage in comparatively to all the other grasses that are being grown out there. So it is a good grass, can be grown in Kansas, but we don't use it in home lawns. We will touch on fine leaf fescues. A lot of times those are mixed in with tall fescues. They do have some shade tolerance, but they are not very heat and drought tolerant as well. So sometimes you see those mixed in with your tall fescue to help in the shady areas in maybe your landscape. So the cool season grasses, they best grow during the spring and the fall, very difficult to grow in the summertime. Now during the summertime, they may go dormant if you let them go dormant, which dormant means it kind of shuts itself down and then doesn't really grow until the temperatures are right. There is a fine between dormant and dead with cool season grasses. It's very tough to see and tell that line. But with a little bit of water, a little bit of fertilizer, that tall fescue or cool season grasses and Kentucky bluegrass can be able to come out of that summer dormancy phase. This may mean instead of watering to keep it lush and green and growing, maybe we're watering once every 2.5 weeks to give it enough to keep it alive, just to get going for that short period of time, and then it still kind of stays in that dormant phase. So the first cool season grass we're going to talk about is tall fescue. It is one of the most adapted to the landscape in Kansas and works really, really well for home lawns. It has a lot longer year-round green color. But it is a bunch type grass, which means one seed, one plant. So if we lose this grass in the summertime, we are going to have to reseed in those bare areas. It has rolled vernation. It is a more coarser leaf texture than your other turf grasses. These newer varieties of tall fescue, though, are having a very fine leaf blade, and those are going to be called turf type tall fescues, and we'll get to that in a minute. It does have very prominent veins. If you know tall fescue, you can identify tall fescue. This is the best grass species to make a thumb whistle, as I call it, where you can rip the leaf blade off, put it between your thumbs. If you're ever in a thumb whistle contest, this one will always win. So, and it's a pointed leaf tip, which is important to note because Kentucky bluegrass has a boat-shaped leaf tip. Sometimes it can be hard to tell the difference. So this is one of the identifying characteristics. Here's the prominent venation in the tall fescue. This is Kentucky 31, which is one of the older species, but it's still commonly used in a lot maybe more rural settings. So it is the best adapted for lawns, parks. I see it on sports fields, on golf courses, here, there, and everywhere because it does have good cold tolerance. It does have good heat tolerance. It germinates quickly. Seeds quickly in about 3 to 5 days in perfect conditions. Now, there's never been perfect conditions ever out there. These are studies that have been done in greenhouses and growth chambers. So I know that a lot of these numbers that you may see are going to be, I call them textbook numbers because someone did research on it and found an actual number. So it is a 3 to 5 days. One of my good friends just seeded his lawn not too long ago, and in about 7 to 8 days he had germination. So not many days of perfect conditions in Kansas, so just be aware of that. It does have a coarser blade, but the newer varieties are definitely finer. We call those the turf-type tall fescues. These are the ones you're going to look for in the stores. They're called 5-way blends. I don't know, Kansas Premium. They're going to be named a lot of different types of things. Kentucky 31 is the older variety, very coarse, very light green, and it does not have the resistance to diseases and insects. It's not as attractive. I do know some people still use it in their lawns. I see a lot more people put it on low maintenance-ish, or what I'll call the back 40. They'll grow the turf-type tall fescues around the house, and then maybe they'll just put Kentucky 31 on the 5-6 acres back there that they're not doing anything to, but they want fescue type of thing. Many a times Kentucky 31 seed is going to be contaminated. It will be contaminated with weed seeds or what's called other crops. When we get to the seed label section, you'll see this is crucial when it comes to pest management or weed management in turf, because the easiest way to control weeds is not seed weeds into your lawn type of thing. So be aware of that. A lot of times your K31 in Kansas is going to be cheaper. You see it at like a Tractor Supply or even the big box stores. It's not a bad grass, but it does have its fit. Now, tall fescue is the best choice for shade for Kansas. It does have good shade tolerance, and you can see here in the picture, this is with the tree, and shade from the tree, shade from the building, but there is a difference between shade from a building and shade from a tree. Shade from a tree not only is shade, but you have competition from tree roots for water, for nutrients. And so many times, as you can see here, the tree roots competing for the grass for moisture is why the grass is not performing as well, not necessarily the shade. As you can see, the shade is actually outside of that underperforming turf area. So it's easier a lot of times to grow grass and shade next to a building than it is to grow grass under a tree. But tall fescue does have good shade tolerance. Now, the way researchers study shade tolerance is we plant a bunch of different species and we use shade cloth at different percentages. But shade cloth doesn't compete for air, for water, it doesn't compete for nutrients in the soil, so we can actually test shade only. So just know that when we're talking about shade, could be other things, not just the shade itself, contributing to the decline of that turf in an area. So what about the fine leaf fescues? We did mention that before. There are some finer leaf fescues that are different than the turf-type tall fescues. These are what's called true fine leaf fescues. On a seed label, they're going to be called a chewings fescue, a hard, a creeping red, or a sheep's fescue. Now, these are good, and they do have good shade tolerance, and better than any of the other turf grasses that we grow. But it does have poor heat tolerance and cannot come through the summer very well at all. So these are grown more northern climates than Kansas, because they have cooler climates and maybe a little bit milder summers where they're able to grow. Not recommended by itself, but it's okay to have one of those 4 varieties that may be in your seed blend be one of these fine fescues, because many a times we don't have 100% shaded lawn or 100% full sun lawn. We have shaded areas in one pocket, and so if they have these varieties and species within a seed blend, then if it can predominantly grow in a shady area, and then your other species grow in a sunny area, and other species can grow in a wet area or a dry area, then from the naked eye, as you're looking out, you can't tell the difference between these species or varieties, but you got certain populations within that landscape that are thriving in those microclimates, so to say. So that's fine leaf fescues in addition to the tall fescue, very, very well adapted plant species for this. We have Kentucky Bluegrass is the other cool season grass that's grown well in Kansas, or cool season grass that has been grown in Kansas. It has folded vernation. It has a fine leaf texture, especially compared to tall fescue, and it has that boat-shaped leaf tip instead of that prominent leaf tip like tall fescue does. A benefit or a positive attribute of Kentucky Bluegrass is it does have rhizomes as well. A lot of athletic fields can use Kentucky bluegrass because it has that rhizome. It's able to come back in if it's tore up a little bit. For home lawns, I don't see as many 100% Kentucky bluegrass lawns, but I do blended with tall fescue. Maybe a 90-10 or a 95-5 where it's 90% tall fescue, 10% Kentucky bluegrass. And so what that does is maybe you do have some voids, whether it be from disease or heat or something, and then Kentucky bluegrass will able to send out a rhizome and fill in some of those bare areas. It blends very well with tall fescue, but doesn't have that heat tolerance tall fescue does. It can be seeded or sodded. The germination is slower. We're talking 10 to 14 days. So in real life, we're probably looking at greater than 14 days. Even after it germinates, it's slower to establish. Once you get it established, it grows pretty well, but it is slower to establish than tall fescue. Like I said, it is less heat tolerant compared to fescue, and it will go dormant in the summertime quicker than tall fescue will. So it's going to turn brown because it doesn't like the heat and the drought. It's going to turn brown faster. But it's able to come back and may be able to come back because it has those rhizomes under that ground, where tall fescue doesn't have rhizomes. So if that tall fescue plant dies, you got to reseed in the fall. If that Kentucky bluegrass plant dies, it may have made 10 or 12 more plants around that area, and if one of those survived, then it can kind of fill back in as well. So that is, and it may be rejuvenated with a little bit of water and fertilizer because those rhizomes are there. Here's a better picture of a up close of Kentucky bluegrass. You can see the finer textured compared to the tall fescue. That's why a lot of people kind of like it instead of tall fescue. I see more of this species being grown more western Kansas than here in central or eastern Kansas. Tall fescue does really, really well in eastern Kansas. But you're seeing every once in a while a lawn that is 100% Kentucky bluegrass. Now that sums up all our cool season grasses. We have 3 warm season grasses that we would like to talk about. Some people love warm season grasses and some people don't. They go brown in the wintertime, or dormant in the wintertime, as you can see by this picture in the bottom right here. And it's not as green as long as the Kentucky bluegrass and the tall fescue, and that's why some people don't like them. And the grass species that are commonly grown are Zoysiagrass, Bermuda grass, and buffalo grass. But there are some things about warm season grasses. They have better heat and drought tolerance than the cool season grasses. They're able to survive and thrive in the summer months comparatively to the tall fescue and Kentucky bluegrass. But the drawback is it can be damaged during some of the cold winters. The past couple years we have seen winter damage on Zoysiagrass and Bermuda grass, maybe 10% loss depending on the area, and this has to do with a lot of different things of the duration of how cold it was or how cold it got maybe one particular night, or if it got cold late in the winter when stuff was trying to green back up, it was a late frost or freeze. But the good part about that is, even if you do have some winter injury, these plants have these species have stolons and rhizomes. So as soon as it warms up, if there was some winter injury, it can fill back in those areas, especially if they're small located incidences as well. One of the bad parts about it, poor shade tolerance compared to the other turf species. Now out of the warm season grasses, Zoysiagrass does the best in the shade, but no grass actually likes the shade. They all prefer full sun. Some can just tolerate it. And if we're grouping the warm season grasses comparatively to the cool season grasses, the warm season grasses have very poor shade tolerance compared to cool season. But within warm season grasses, Zoysiagrass tends to have the better shade tolerance, which is the first one we're going to talk about here. Zoysiagrass makes a very nice, fine, dense turf. It has a very golden or lighter green color compared to some of the other turf grass species. It has both stolons and rhizomes, so it can rejuvenate from itself. It's a coarser texture, it's stiff. I don't know if you've ever walked on Zoysiagrass. You kind of just stand on it, smush, spongy. It's a very stiff, upright type of grass. It doesn't lay over, it's not as wispy type of grass species. It can have thatch problems. We'll discuss what thatch is a little bit later, but this is one of the turfgrass species that just develops thatch faster than other turfgrass species. And it's used on lawns, golf courses, a lot of fairways on golf courses, a lot of tees on golf courses, because it can be mown very low and it can be mown at very high mowing heights. Where our cool season grasses typically, other than creeping bent grass, cannot be mown very low. They are more of they want to be growing upright, so you have to mow them a little higher. So it fits that niche of golf courses. But it can be grown in a home lawn as well. Now within Kansas, there are a bunch of zoysiagrass varieties out there. Within Kansas, we pretty much have two options. You have a vegetative variety, which is called Meyer, which means it can only be sod, plugged, or sprigged. You cannot buy that seed and go seed that variety of Meyer. There is a seeded variety called Zenith, and that is the best seeded variety of zoysiagrass for Kansas. It has the good cold tolerance compared to some of the other zoysiagrasses that are grown in more southern states or southern areas that are more warm. But it's not as cold tolerant as Meyer if you compared them side by side type of thing. But seed is a lot cheaper than sod is. And seed is a lot easier to install than the back-breaking plugging work. If you're going out and installing a plug every 2 or foot, 18 inches type of thing. But there are two options out there. K-State is working on some newer varieties. Dr. Jack Fry actually just released this variety here on the left. This is called Innovation Zoysiagrass. It hopefully soon will be available. It's out now at like 14, it's at 14 sod producers right now, and they're trying to get the stock up and have enough of it so then it's available to the public. A while ago there was a Kansas variety release called Chisholm. I don't know if it's on the market, if it's available right now. It worked really well in home lawns. One of the drawbacks that we saw here, it was so rigid, it was so tough. When you mowed it, it was hard to mow. So it would kind of frail the ends, even with sharp blades and everything. As you can see in this picture, it can take a beating, but it was tough on mowers just to maintain it. We still have a lot of this out at our research farm. It's very persistent. We've left it alone and haven't done a lot to it, and it still comes back and still grows. So zoysiagrass is a good grass for Kansas. One of the other warm seasons, because Bermuda grass has all these stolons and rhizomes. Well, everyone where that new plant grows, that's kind of like a seed. So if you took this and you chopped it up, you would be able to plant those nodes on those stolons and rhizomes, and new plants would come from it. So that's called sprigging. And that can be done successfully with Bermuda grass in about 6 weeks. So that's another option if you're ever wanting to manage Bermuda grass. Now, remember, this is the improved varieties of Bermuda grass, and we're not talking about the common Bermuda grass that's aggressive and hard to control. I do not know if that is a shrub under there, a small child. We're not really sure, but you can see how aggressive that it grows. That's what you would want to stay away from, and that's more of a weed type in turf systems. Now the last grass we're going to talk about is buffalo grass. Buffalo grass is a great turf grass for Kansas. It's actually the only native turfgrass species that we grow in home lawns. Only native to North America. The other turfgrass species are native to other parts of the world. It does have stolons, so it can creep along the surface of the soil. It generally has a lighter gray color. That's what some people don't like them, because it kind of has, it's not as dark a green. It's not that lush green that is desired when it comes to turf. But it is a very beautiful grass species. It does have hairs. You can see the hairs on it. And it is not fairly cold tolerant, but it is really good cold tolerance. It is a native species, and it's been around for a long time. And so it is good cold tolerance, and works really well in Kansas. And it's a low maintenance grass. Now, I'm not saying it's a no maintenance grass, but it is a low maintenance grass. If a little bit goes a long way, but if you're wanting a more intensely managed grass, this is not the grass for you. Over maintaining buffalo grass actually is detrimental to it than than under-maintaining that grass species. Now, bluegrass does have seeds on it, as you can see down here in the female flower, and this is the male flower. We talked about vegetative and seeded varieties of other grass species. Vegetative varieties of buffalo grass are not going to have this seed head or this male flower sticking above the canopy. It's only going to have this female flower down in the canopy. Seeded varieties will have both. It's going to have that male flower. Some people don't like that look to it. I got a picture here in a second of what it is. But what I want to point out is this is where the seed is located, in that female flower. Buffalo grass is a little bit different of other turfgrass species, is that seed is underneath or within that canopy. It's not sticking out like all the other turfgrass species. Bermuda grass, Zoysiagrass, Kentucky bluegrass, tall fescue are other common grass species that we grow in Kansas. It grows leaves, and then when it produces seeds, it shoots out a stalk above the canopy. So they're able to harvest that a lot like wheat, a lot easier because of the separation of the vegetation and the seeds. Now with this seed being located within the canopy, it's hard to get to and it's hard to harvest. And that's one of the reasons that buffalo grass seed, if you look at the price on the bag, is more expensive. Because of the difficulty to harvest. Someone else had to take an extra step to clean it. The success rate of harvesting is a lot lower, so therefore it's passed on to the end consumer. Doesn't mean it's like super high, it's like perfect or anything, but it just took a little bit more work to get to that seed whenever you're harvesting. I like to point out that fun fact because a lot of people don't really sometimes recognize where the seed is located within the plant, and a lot of people think that that is the actual seed when it's actually the male flower. So here you can see a seeded variety on the right that will produce these male flowers above the canopy, but that is not the seed, that is just a male flower. And the vegetative variety is here on the left, and it does not produce those varieties, or those those male flowers above. Sundancer species that I mentioned, it does have a dark green color, a nice beautiful buffalo grass. I like to show two pictures of buffalo grass. This one here, this is buffalo grass growing in the crack of a concrete. So I figured if it can grow in the crack of concrete, we should be able to cultivate it and grow it in our lawn. And right here, this is beautiful. This is out in I can't even remember, out western Kansas. And the buffalo grass has gone dormant in the summer heat here in the front of the picture, and then in the back of the picture, it's also gone dormant. Now in the middle of this is green, lush growing buffalo grass. It's not being watered. It's not. No one's going out there and watering it. But there is a hose that goes through it, okay? And that's to water some trees on the other side of that park. And there was just a small leak in that hose. And just enough of that, little bit of that water kept that buffalo grass green and growing during the summer. And so that's why I say a little bit goes a long way. A little bit really goes a long way. And if you're just watering a little bit, then it keeps it lush and growing, and then it helps prevent the weeds from growing in. Not to mention, it's easier to tell green weeds in brown grass than it is green weeds in green grass. So the perception is the same as well. Quick story to finish up this section. I'll put this for more information. We got the handbook, but you can look at those. There's a friend of mine that runs a golf course in western Kansas that has buffalo grass fairways, and they are unirrigated except for the main line that runs through all the middle of the fairways, and he has a water wheel. Has anybody ever heard or seen of a water wheel? So it's an irrigation system that has a wheel on it, and you pull it out, and it has like a sprinkler on the end, and it kind of retracts itself back. So he has a big one of those. And so he'll go out and he'll water one half of a fairway one day. He'll flip it around and he'll water the other half of the fairway. So it takes him 18 days to water a 9-hole golf course. But then he doesn't do anything for 2 or 3 weeks. That's all he needed was that little bit of water that one day to keep it green and growing. Then he just waits and then starts it all over again. So a little bit does go a long way. It's a great turf grass. Now here you can see the resources and the publications. And that concludes the turfgrass species that are adapted for Kansas and some morphology and identifying characteristics. Moving on, we will talk about mowing turf grasses, cultivating turf grasses, and other aspects of just managing turf grass in the landscape. Thank you.